Welcome to the Hyper Guide Motivational Podcast. Thank you for being here today. I have an amazing guest here, Alex Culley, and I'm going to kind of get into this more and explain more. This podcast is going to be a little different than the other podcasts. Alex has an amazing podcast. He just started this podcast about a month and a half ago, Alex? About a month and a half ago. And Alex is doing amazing things. He has a podcast called Learning the Hardway the Easy Way. And Alex, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? I want you to give me a little bit of your intro because you have so much insight. You're just an amazing man. So we did part 1 on Alex's podcast. Alex, what's the best way they can hear part 1? Are you on all the platforms?
I am. So the podcast again is Learning the Hard Way, the Easy Way. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we have a lot of fun. A lot of podcasts talk about great people and why they're so great, but we kind of flip that on its head. And each episode is interviewing someone like yourself, Fig, with a lot to share, a lot of experience, expertise, and we really base the whole episode on one question. What's a mistake you made? What's something that you didn't do well? And what did you learn from it? So that the listeners can gain from their experience. So learning the hard way, the easy way is really about learning from people who've had to learn things the hard way, so you can avoid mistakes. And, I started it, the youngest of 3. I have 2 older brothers. So I learned early how to learn from others. And I remember so many of their mistakes I saw and said, nope, not going to do that. And that's, I think, really been a through line in my life of, it's great. Experience is the best teacher. But if you can learn from the experiences of others, I think that puts you far ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to just ask everybody, if you really want to learn a lot, check out his podcast. They're really amazing. Some are a little shorter, some are a little longer, and it's kind of based upon where it goes in the interview. But, what I love about the podcast, and I was telling Alex this on his podcast as well, is that it's Alex made an investment on interviewing people about their experiences so that you can learn from their mistakes. And it's going to motivate you to be a better person at work and at home. And I really, really love that. Hey, Alex, can you tell me really quickly, I know you've got the podcast, but can you tell me about what do you do for the work part of your life, and then where you went to school? I'd really like to know that and let the audience know.
Sure. Podcaster, not my full-time job. So I'm the executive director of a consulting firm called the Institute for Executive Development. We're based in Las Vegas, where I'm from, but we have clients in Las Vegas and throughout the country. We work with typically senior level leaders, executives in all industries and sectors, public, private, nonprofit. And really our business is focused on 3 specific areas of expertise that we offer: leadership and team development, strategic planning, and executive coaching. By way of education, I always kind of thought I would go into marketing and advertising. So I wanted to be, one step ahead, though. So instead of just going to business school like everybody else, I started with psychology. I figured if you could understand people's motivations and why they buy, then you could sell them stuff better. So I got to school, studied psychology. I also got into political science. What's politics but the selling of people and ideas? But I recognized pretty early in undergrad, I was a little bit like a fish out of water. Every one of my psychology classes were going on to be a therapist or a clinician, things like that. All the political science people wanted to be lawyers or in government. And so my interests were kind of at the cross section of that. When I graduated, I knew I needed to still get a little smarter. So I ended up going to graduate school at the University of Southern California, Phi-Don, in a Master's of Applied Psychology, and really had kind of two dual tracks. On one side was organizational psychology, and on the other was consumer psychology. So I got exposure to both. I ended up focusing more on consumer sales, marketing, advertising, and went into market research after that. When I finished school, I lived in Los Angeles for about a year working at a market research firm. And it was a small firm, but we had some big name clients. And I remember I was doing these very interesting things, interesting projects, but I still wasn't fulfilled. And a day that'll sort of change my life, I remember, is I had asked to create a training for other people at my level to do this kind of one thing related to screening for focus groups. And I remember I had more enjoyment creating that training than I did doing the actual job. And so when that happened, I had a realization that, you know what, I am in the wrong industry. So I transitioned. At the same time, my then girlfriend, now wife, ironically was starting as a therapist in graduate school. And so I knew I was moving home, and I was looking for work kind of in the organizational psychology field, training. And someone who you know very well, Professor Culley, who is my dad, had started the business. I kind of told him, and in his way, he said, "Oh, very interesting." Didn't say anything about it. I came back into town a few weeks later, and still working remotely. And he, had sat down in his office, and he started to talk for about 45 minutes about this big project he had. It was going to require a lot of research, and he needed help. He was going to hire an outsider, but because of my skill set, he thought it would be a good fit. And Fig, I'll tell you, I have never seen my dad so flustered as those 45 minutes. So when he made the offer and offered me a job, I didn't even have the heart to haggle. I just took the pen, signed the thing, and that was about 6 years ago, and we've been going ever since.
Can I ask you a question, Alex? And we're going to get into this more. I want to know, what was the biggest challenge when you started working with your dad? Because you work with pretty massive public and private companies. What was the biggest challenge for you? And that's part one. And part two, and I know people hate when I ask these questions, but part one is, what was the biggest challenge for you? And part two, what was the biggest problem you saw in public and private organizations in terms of leadership?
Well, the answer, I guess, is a little bit connected. So when I started, I was 25. I'm 30 now. And I thought, especially because we were working with senior level executives, people who, they had as much work experience as I had earth experience. I thought my age was a big inhibitor. And I remember in my first 6 months or so, we were working with a client, that big project kind of in the Midwest. And I was talking to one of the executives we worked with a lot. And she was tough. I mean, she had worked in some pretty hard organizations and no nonsense. And I remember sharing, hey, for some feedback, my age, does it hold me back? And, she looked at me, she said, "You don't get it. Your age isn't what holds you back. It's your superpower." She said, because people at our level, at the executive level, they don't get to hear from someone with your perspective in a language they can understand. And Fig, that changed my life when she said it, because she was right. I recognized that, I've always been someone who can fit in regardless of the age of the group I'm with. Being able to communicate, when you have, like I did, grew up with an executive coach for a dad, you just learn how to speak the language early. And being able to talk to people at that level in ways that they could process and understand, but share things that they don't get to hear because that's not the people they spend their time with. If they're spending time with people my age, more likely it's their kids. And so being able to, on an even playing field, communicate perspectives of generations of skill sets and sets of experiences that they didn't understand, but doing it in a way that doesn't make them feel old. I think that's what's helped me work at this level. And, second part of your question is, what are the biggest challenges in organizations? It's often just that. It's that, they talk about, well, how do we motivate our employees? How do we reach our clients? And yet the people sitting around having these discussions they're not the same age as the people they're trying to reach. A lot of times they don't look like, in terms of diversity, gender, the people they're trying to reach. And so in organizations, I found, people who rise to the top, they do so because they're highly qualified, they're skilled, they're experienced, but they got those skills and experiences and qualifications at a different time. And especially post-pandemic, when the rate of change was magnified incredibly, the old rules don't really work anymore. And so I think I found a sweet spot. And I've often joked I'm going to have to get a different shtick, when I start growing up. But I'm very grateful. I'm very fortunate to have the opportunities I have. And I've come to find from our clients, they get a lot of value out of it, because there's a lot of consultants or expertises out there of people who come from the same generation or perspectives or insights that they grew up in, but they don't often get to hear from someone that represents a generation that's the majority of their workforce, the majority of their clients or their customers, and especially in a way that's strategic.
So we talked about this in podcast 1. That's why people have to listen to podcast 1. Is the mirror analogy that your dad always brings up, which is when we're looking in the mirror, we're only seeing a small part of ourselves, right? We're seeing maybe 30%. So there's sometimes there's 70% and sometimes even more that we're not seeing as a leader. And not just as a leader, but even as an employee in your organization. A lot of times we have these blind spots that we don't know our weaknesses are. How do you handle those conversations with other employees or with, like you said, very successful leaders without them taking it the wrong way?
Well, so, first and foremost, I always ask before tell. My starting point is to ask questions. And whatever I'm going to say, make sure I can connect it back to what people are interested in. So, my wife will often joke that I don't really talk about work much in social settings. But that doesn't mean I don't think about it, because, every person comes up to you and they're venting about their problem. They're talking. I'm thinking, gosh, I have a couple of training modules that would really be helpful. But people don't want to hear that, right? People often don't want you to solve their problem. So before I give any feedback, before I give any input, suggestions, perspectives, I have to listen to make sure that's what they really want. So that's one. Two, often I don't root what I'm saying in just my perspective. I root it in feedback or comments I've heard from others. So in order to get that, you have to make people feel comfortable that you're not going to break their confidentiality, make them feel comfortable that you're really listening. I think listening goes at the heart of effective communication. The best communicators are people who can most effectively listen so that they know what the best thing to communicate is.
I get to steal from your podcast right now, which is, what is the most difficult challenge you ever had in your work career? And it doesn't necessarily have to be this one. And then how did you overcome it and handle it? What's been a challenging thing for you to get over? And if you can be specific about, you don't have to be specific with names and all that stuff, but with the most difficult challenge you've had in terms of a failure. And it can be a personal one, or it can be a professional one.
Well, of my many failures to draw from, I will kind of just build on what I just mentioned. I think the times when I've gotten in the most trouble is when I shared coaching or feedback or a suggestion with someone who wasn't ready or interested in hearing it. And there's a specific time I'll tell you about. We were working with a public agency here in Las Vegas. They are central to the valley, and sort of, I mean, literally, they're immeasurably important to what Las Vegas does. And but they also are a public agency, and so with all that goes along with that. And so we met the leader of this organization. We started, as we often do, with kind of a needs assessment, which included interviewing all of the top people and asking them, what does the organization do well? What are its challenges? What do you think is needed in the next couple of years, months, in order to continue to improve? And this was 3 or 4 years ago. And so, in the coming 2020. And so we did that. These were 90-minute interviews with maybe 15 people. And all of the input we heard, there was things kind of, the usual suspects. We don't spend enough time team building, camaraderie. We don't have clear direction. We don't know how our part fits to the greater vision. So, okay, those are easy. We can put together that. But then we started to hear this incredibly consistent feedback about the boss. And it was simply this: that if you say something that the boss doesn't like, you will get put into timeout. You will get sidelined. You will get minimized. You could be the top performer. And if you say the wrong thing to the boss, and often it was something they don't want to hear against their ideas or what they were trying to accomplish, that, you won't get fired, but you will get sidelined and railroad, and you will just not be a key member of the team anymore. So watch out. So, okay, we got all the recommendations together. We did a training, and that was great. We made a proposal to help them develop kind of a long-term strategic plan, and that was got all green lights. So this was going to be a multi-year, turn into a multi-year engagement, big project with a highly visible organization. And we had several meetings with the boss, and we're given, sort of the report on the feedback. It was all this different stuff, and kind of right at the finish line of the deal. And then we, as part of our integrity of what we heard, communicated this piece of feedback that the team had shared about the leader that we were talking to. And it was simply, hey, one thing that we heard that's been very consistent is that one of your areas for improvement, that if someone speaks out against an idea or doesn't support what you're trying to do, you'll minimize them, you'll sideline them, you'll put them in timeout. And Fig, I could tell, right away that person was not ready to hear what we had to say. We had to say it because that was what they told us. We had an obligation. But for whatever reason, we just missed the mark on the communication of it. And so what turned in, was a multi-year project, kind of a big deal. Pretty soon, we found out we were the ones now put in timeout. And that was the last meeting we ever had with that leader. We, the term I think is got ghosted. We heard from a couple of their people and kind of going on, but we never actually got communication again from that leader. And Sally Helgeson, who I interviewed on my podcast before, her mistake was learning that you don't always get a second chance. As much as you might like it, you don't always get that second chance. And I think, from the mistake I made of telling someone something when they weren't ready to hear it, I became intimately familiar with the idea that no, you don't always get a second chance, and sometimes projects are just gone.
So I want to get, that's very interesting to me, because the irony of to me, and I know you processed this already, is trying to figure out so you're getting paid to do this job. But the people that are paying you have to understand and be ready to maybe hear things that they don't want to hear. So everything that all those people were complaining about, and we talked about psychological safety in part one, the leader actually, in some ways, backed up what everybody said. So when you were done with this, is it really, I know you have to worry about the money part of it, but I know you do the work because you want to make a difference, Alex. I know that. So for me, I think as much as it would have probably hurt my bottom line, at the end of the day, I would know ethically I did what I was supposed to do. And ironically, this leader wasn't ready to hear what everyone else said. And he basically backed up exactly what everyone else said. And it always boggles my mind that these leaders don't get it, that they're hurting the organization more than they're helping the organization. It just, I don't know. How did you feel afterwards? And did you, in some ways, process this as a loss? Or did you process this as, you know what? We did what we're supposed to do ethically. This person just wasn't ready to hear, the truth, I guess, in some way.
Well, often what we need to hear the most, we want to hear the least. And if something, pisses you off or makes you uncomfortable, it's a good sign that it touched on something true. So, to the point of, is it a loss or, I think on a business side, of course it was a loss. I mean, we lost the project. From a learning experience side, it's been the gift that keeps on giving. I don't know that, it was many years ago and Rick and I, we still sort of laugh about it, but there's some pain behind that laughter too. Not just because we lost the project, but because we weren't able to help that leader get better. And, you have to meet people where they are if you're going to lead them to where you think they need to go. As a coach, as an organizational leader, as a manager, and you talked a lot about this in part one. But I think I feel bad that we weren't able to do justice or do right by the people who trusted us and shared all that. And if I could go back and have a do-over, of course there were things that we would work to do differently, knowing what we now know. Now, would we ever have been able to get the message across? I don't know. One thing I do know is that, what brings out my personal and professional best is working with people who want to get better, who we have a high degree of trust. They know at the end of the day, everything I'm doing is trying to help them. And I know that when I share coaching, they may not like it, but they will at least listen to it and reflect on it and take it for what it is without some sort of attributing deeper meaning. So I don't think, I think things can be both losses and wins. And I think this definitely falls into that category. And, it's a big example of a mistake I've made many times, which is telling people things that they're not quite ready to hear.
What is the biggest challenge? And I know this is a really big question here. So can you explain how difficult it is to change a culture in a massive system? And I know that there's a special quote that everybody uses about culture, right? And maybe you can talk about that a little bit. But can you tell me what those challenges are and how do you deal with those challenges?
Well, I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach. My favorite definition of culture is simply the way we do things around here. So first and foremost, in culture change, you have to understand that it's going to take time. As individuals, the research shows it takes about 6 months to start, stop, or change a behavior, and another 3 to 6 months to turn that behavior into a habit. So a year is the absolute minimum for an individual to change a behavior and turn it into a habit. Now, when you're working with hundreds or thousands of individuals, it gets far more complex. So when you're looking to change organizational culture, the first thing you need is buy-in from leadership that you want and understand what the vision of the culture you want to create is, and they're committed to following through on whatever those changes are, even when it gets tough. In public agencies, this can be hard because maybe there's elected officials who come in and have different visions of it. Maybe there's retirement qualifications. People have to leave. They can't see it through. So first and foremost, you need organizational leadership to buy in. I think secondly, as you're going sort of top down on the change, you also need to take an approach bottom up. So I found in organizations that you can talk to different people and at every level, and you hear the same thing at every level. And then you ask yourself, okay, well, if everyone thinks this, why hasn't it changed? A great example is meetings. I have never met someone who doesn't say something like, we have too many meetings. We meet too often and we aren't able to get enough done. So I say, well, why don't you have less meetings? Well, I don't know. They're on the calendar. So making sure that you listen to people and actually hear what they're saying needs to change. As a consultant, I know that there's no idea I have that's going to be better than the people who actually work there. And the closer you get to the problem or to the front lines, the better the ideas get because those people really live and experience it. So organizational leadership bought in. Then you have to get a bottom-up approach to get the ideas and the suggestions. And this is kind of like the wellspring that you keep drawing from. Now, whatever changes you're going to make, you make sure to connect it back to what people have said needs to happen. Even if it was just one or two very bright people who really get it. They don't have to be majority consensus opinions. You just have to make sure that you've gotten the ideas from the people who actually work there. So organizational leadership, leadership from the mid-level or the front line, the ideas. Then you have to approach, mid-level management. Those can be huge blockers in any change effort. Why? Because they've benefited from the way it is. They've benefited from the status quo. And so you have to meet with those people, not leave them out of the loop, not cut them out, but meet with them and explain and show, here's how this will benefit you too. What you talked about, understanding they may all be motivated by different things. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And I don't, kid myself into thinking that we're going to be able to flip the hearts and minds of everyone we speak with. In fact, that's not really so important. What's more important is that people change the behaviors. My wife, the therapist, she would talk about, okay, well, why are you like this? What happened in your childhood? And, what was your experiences growing up? I don't really, that's not really so relevant for me. I am a behaviorist. I know that if you can change the behavior, eventually the attitude will follow. It's easier to act yourself into a new way of thinking than it is to think yourself into a new way of acting. And in organizations, this comes with policies, infrastructure, systems, and processes. And so as you get sort of the ideas of what you want the culture to change, you recognize the challenges, then you have to get into the operational nuts and bolts and say, okay, what are things that prevent this? Go back to the meetings example. Well, we know that we have this weekly meeting on the calendar. Okay, well, can we turn it to every other week? Well, we know that whenever we schedule a meeting, it's for 60 minutes. Okay, well, can we turn those into 45 or 30-minute meetings? So it's getting down really to a very granular level. And at this point, we're now not the ones pushing that change. We're helping the people who work there identify and act on it because they have to have ownership. If it's just the consultant, we're not going to stay around forever. So we really often want to work ourselves out of a job and make sure people have the skills, the tools, they've learned enough and gotten collaborators with us enough that they can go and act changes on the big and the small, to make sure that the infrastructure, the organizational carrots and sticks are all set up to facilitate this change effort. So hopefully that, is.
Oh my God, that was great, Alex. And that's why I love that statement. I think many years ago I didn't understand what it meant when it says, "Why does culture eat strategy for breakfast?" Some people say, "Why does culture eat strategy for lunch?" or whatever, however you want to say it. It essentially means that, you could have all the strategy in the world and you could have amazing ideas, but if the culture is not accepting of those strategies and ideas, it goes nowhere. And I think that's what you see a lot of organizations fail because of what you said, the culture. It's always been that way. And then it continues and continues and continues as a status quo level. Nobody wants that change. There's so many resistance. And these massive, large organizations, you're pushing it up against a culture that's just been like that for so long. And unfortunately, there's a lot of cultures in private and government organizations that are just not healthy. But and there's been leaders that have come in with all these great strategies and it goes nowhere, right? And have you seen that when you've met some leaders that they didn't realize it was the culture, but they had all these great ideas, but they didn't realize it was the culture that needed to be worked on first?
Oh, yeah. In fact, just about every leader I know, and we do a lot of work with leaders transitioning into new jobs or new roles in a large organization. They get promoted and now they're put over this division. And the first thing everybody wants to do is say, okay, here's why what you're doing was messed up, and here's my ideas to fix it. That is a trap. That is a very seductive trap that people fall into. Because nobody wants to be told what they've been doing is wrong. Even if they think it's been wrong, the positioning of it is basically, I'm the savior. I'm the smart one. Nobody could figure this out except for me. So, and it ignores, the organizational carrots and sticks that exist. And you when you are a boss and you walk in with all these ideas, you're basically saying, I think I know the solution without actually knowing the problem. And my mom is a doctor, a physician, and she'll say, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice. So as a leader, the first thing you have to do for the first 3 months, this is our kind of core game plan, is you have to go on a series of listening meetings, call it a listening tour. And the best leaders take a systematic approach to listening. And they ask a core set of questions. They meet with people at every level. They record the data they're hearing. It's easy to ask questions, but if you ask questions and then don't do anything with it, what's the point? So they record the data, they get it in writing, they follow up, they say, hey, this is what I heard. This is what everyone's telling me. Now, here are the things that I'm going to do based on what you've said. And the more you can connect what your game plan and your action is back to what people have told you, the better. Here's the great irony. It's not likely going to be any different than what you would have done in the first place. But by taking the time to ask people to listen, you show that you are showing deference and respect, and an understanding that there needs to be buy-in. People need to be bought in. And one of the things we'll often say is people need the opportunity to weigh in before they can be expected to buy in. I think that's not the common practice, but it's certainly something I've seen be successful.
This is going to be a tough question for you, Alex. I know you're used to these, so I'm going to give it to
bring
you.
them on.
Okay. How do you deal with and motivate a bad employee or a bad leader or manager, however you want to put it?
So, I think I just say, this is something you and I talked about on my podcast, and I think there's a lot of insight that you shared. So for anyone who likes this question and and wants to hear Fig's response. There's of course that, but my first reaction is, how do you define bad? Because I think there's a perception that, being a bad leader or bad employee, does that mean underperforming? That's one set of responses. Or does that mean lacks integrity and doesn't share the organizational values? So I'll start with that. Just a quick word. If someone lacks integrity, if someone doesn't share organizational values, that's not something you're going to change. That's something that you have to ensure that you follow the accountability mechanisms so that person isn't in the organization anymore. Because that kind of toxic behavior, if someone's discriminatory or abusive, it's just not worth your time trying to enlighten this individual. And if that's your boss, then my coaching would be, well, have you considered other opportunities? But now let's go to the other definition of bad, which is, underperforming or ineffective. So the first thing you want to do if someone is not performing at the level you think they should is try and figure out what are the root causes and what are the symptoms of those causes. Oftentimes, employee underperformance is the symptom of things going on at home, of, maybe they've had a tough experience. Maybe they've been burned before or poorly treated. And you talked a lot about psychological safety. So making sure you're listening to this person without agenda to really understand where they're coming from so that you can tailor and design whatever solution to their needs and to their motivations. So when managing someone who is a bad leader, bad employee, the first thing you have to understand is what'll work for you won't necessarily work for them. The second thing you have to understand is, how much energy am I going to invest, and what is the outcome I want to get this person to? You can't turn everybody into a high achiever. You can't turn every bad employee into a top employee. And making sure that you're just very clear about what is the ultimate objective you're trying to achieve. If you're just trying to get them to play ball or say the right thing, great. If you have higher ambitions than that, then you really need to make sure you're in it for the long haul. I'll answer this one final way in, what if I work on a team and my team's great, the organizational values are great, but there's another department or another team and, the leader there, maybe they don't lack integrity, but they're not collaborative or they have different objectives. How do you navigate around or through that person? My number one go-to response is you have to make sure that you are building relationships, strengthening connections, so that if someone in the organization is talking bad about you, is putting you down, is rumoring, gossiping, that you've building up credibility with others so that this person doesn't affect the perception of you throughout the organization. It's not easy. And sometimes you find yourself thinking, why am I spending all this time just trying to outmaneuver or outflank this individual? But you have to align your input to the desired output. And if that's not an environment you want to work in or the type of people you want to work in, then you need to recognize that and say, okay, well, how can I get myself out of this situation? Do I leave the team? Do I leave and go to a new company? Or something in between?
Oh, I love that answer. I absolutely love that answer because I think, like you said, you might have somebody undermining you, but if you lose credibility with your own management team because of those things, then it can really undermine the entire. Well, it undermines the vision, the mission, everything else as part of it, as part of the organizational structure. It starts to fall apart. I know it's a hot button topic. We talked about this in part one, and I can't believe we're 39 minutes into this, and I'm not going to hold you longer than an hour. So the question I have for you is, it seems to be COVID forced a lot of organizations to telework. A lot of organizations, and if you look at like Harvard Business Review and other reviews, they talked about teleworking being the future. So for a lot of organizations, it sped up this movement toward telework. For some companies, they weren't ready for it at all. So it was a difficult transition, but there's systems in place now that I think we're in a lot better place than we were 2 years ago. And quite frankly, I can't believe the transition that happened that quickly, but I think sadly a pandemic forces that, right? Why is there so much resistance now to teleworking from a lot of executive managers? What is the resistance for them?
So I'll first say that, like any problem, neither of the extremes is ever the right answer. So I think balance is a key here. But to your point of, why is it the dynamic that we see, corporate senior level executives say we need to get back in the office. People on the front line are saying, hey, we are just as productive doing this remotely. And in fact, we're saving a lot of money by not going in, not having a brick and mortar, whatever that is. To me, that dynamic comes from a generational perspective. You look at people in the workforce today, millennials who are under 40, millennials and Gen Z. And these are people who grew up with technology. Either they were born into it, like the Gen Zers who are just starting to enter into the workforce, or younger millennials, or they were exposed to it in very early sort of stages of their maturity. So their aptitude, their comfort is going to be far more than people who, the first time they heard about a computer, the computer took up the size of a full room. Now, is there a better or worse? I don't think there's a better or worse. There's just different. And we don't get to control when we're born. We just have to deal with what we got. So for people who grew up with technology, they're comfortable with it. I remember I was in like the 3rd or 5th grade on instant messenger, and that has fed into this idea that I can communicate with someone texting on the computer, and it's just the same as if I'm in face-to-face. Now, of course, you're missing some of the nuances, some of the, expressions. That's why they came up with emojis, so you can get some of that. But then you have people at work saying, don't emoji your boss. Well, then how do you want me to express, body language or nuance in some of the things I'm saying? So this friction to me really comes, why do corporations, organizations want remote work? Often it's because people at the top of the organization who are more experienced, not just in work, but are of an older generation. They need people around to do their best work. They don't have the same skill set digitally, nor to them is it really the same thing. For baby boomers, the generation born between 1946 and 1964, baby boomers measured success at work as being seen. The longer you were in the office, the more you were working. Whether or not you were getting a lot done, I guess, isn't really relevant, because for that generation, being present, being on site was making an impact. And you'd hear this saying, oh boy, that Alex, he never leaves, he's always working. This is why you had parents of that generation not as present at home. But as Gen X came onto the scene, folks born between 65 and 79, 80, they started to see sort of the folly of that and recognize that work was only one part of your life. And Gen Xers, the research shows, are far more satisfied knowing that work is work. I want to leave when I'm going to leave, and then I want to have a healthy life when I go home. and millennials now even more so around the, find your passion, but also make sure you have healthy work-life balance. But with generations, the pendulum swings. And I think with some of the younger generation now, Gen Z, younger millennials, you see this sort of grind set mentality of you should have a job and a side hustle and a side hustle to your side hustle. And so it's ironic that, the older generation saying get back to work, when the reality is people who work from home probably work more because of the convenience, and they can just sort of walk over to their desk and start working. But the way that it's harder to measure that because the person's not there sitting in front of you. You're not seeing them, burn the midnight oil, and so you don't really understand, what are they doing. But yeah, people actually work more. It's a little bit like companies that say you have unlimited vacation. They see that people take less vacation because it's unlimited. Yet if people get sort of an allotment, they're going to use it every year because they know that they have to use it. So it's a little bit of a paradox, but I think that generational perspective is really coming into play.
Yeah, that's great insight. I love that. I love what you were talking about, the vacation portion of it. And most of the people that I know that telework, I mean, the studies have indicated this too, that people that telework tend to work longer and are more focused, because many times when they're in a work setting, and this is not downplaying the importance of like you said, social interactions, is sometimes you have people, you can get into an hour conversation with somebody that they could have been doing work instead of doing the work. They're having these conversations with everybody. But when they're at home, like you said, many of the people I speak with, they typically work, typically they worked 8 to 5. Well, when they worked at home, guess what? They get on the computer at 6:30 or 7. And then they get off later, or they keep the computer on till 11 o'clock at night, and at work, they would just shut it off and come home. So, it just depends. And I think it goes back to what you said is this before you and I talked about in podcast one, which was making sure you had good quality employees. Because like you said, traditionally people want to say, well, I see them at the office all the time. Well, that doesn't necessarily have a correlation with what they're doing at work. They could be at work that whole time socializing, or they could be doing other things. So I don't think it equals output. And like you said, I think the most important thing is what metrics are you using to measure outputs? If they're doing their work, completing the work on time, what are those outputs are the most significant portion? But sometimes I hear some folks will say, I just want to see him there. And it goes back to that psychological safety and trust. If you're a leader that doesn't trust your employees, how does that ring true, and how does that communicate, I guess, your importance and the value of those employees if you don't have the trust that they're actually doing the work they're supposed to do? I mean, do you see that in your own work, or how does that translate into work performance and productivity in terms of what you see?
Well, I think an element of it is trust. Totally. I know that, we have an admin in our office. She's terrific. And I know that if, she walks in 5 minutes late or something, that she's going to make up that time elsewhere, even if it's 15 minutes, even if it's 20, part of it is you just trust people that they have and care about the work. And everyone kind of has a standard of they want to bring their best if you've created the right environment for that. So how do you create the right environment for that? You can't kid yourself to think and fig, you're a ultra motivated and passionate person. I imagine you're out, mowing the lawn, and you're passionate about getting every corner and, every blade of grass with a measuring stick. You can't kid yourself to think every single person's going to be like that. But everybody is motivated by something, even if that something is being able to pay their bills and being able to make more money in the future. So being able to connect people's motivations to the work, and knowing that you've created an incentive structure that you can trust they will follow through on whatever you've identified because you've tethered it back to what they're interested in. That's one. But I think the second, on an organizational leadership level, is you have to have clear direction. And often leaders are very interested in getting in there, and you hear it. Oh, I want to be the kind of leader that rolls up their sleeves and gets in there with my people. Why would you do that? Because isn't that micromanaging? You should be doing your job. And if you're doing their job, then who's doing yours? So people need to be at a leadership level, create the picture of what you're striving toward, show everybody how what they're doing connects to the bigger picture, and then connect what they're doing back to the bigger picture of their lives. So you can be confident that they're motivated to do a high quality job, even if the connecting of the widgets isn't their passion. This opportunity helps further their passion and get them closer to their ultimate picture of whatever the vision of their life is.
So here's I'm going to do a final tough question here, and I'm going to ask you some personal questions. Why is micromanaging detrimental to an organization? And if you're a person that finds yourself micromanaging, what can you do to not micromanage?
Well, first and foremost, let me ask, why is micromanaging so common? Micromanaging is so common because people are promoted based on their aptitude or skill doing the job. And as soon as they're promoted, everything that they were the best at immediately becomes the wrong thing to do because they have a new job now. So micromanaging is so common because people like doing what they're good at. And when you get promoted, the job you're good at is the job of the people now who work for you. So recognizing first and foremost that is a fact, that exists, is the first step to overcoming it. Number two, if you're a micromanager, how do you get away from it? I think it comes from starting to accept that struggle is a key part of learning. And adults don't like to struggle. The more experience, the more expertise you get, the less you like to struggle. Because, I've worked 25 years. I shouldn't be struggling with this. But if you're not struggling, you're not learning. And if you find your job easy every day with no struggle, it may be hard, it may be taxing, but no struggle, it's a good sign that you're just perpetuating your own status quo. So if you find yourself micromanaging, it's a good sign that you're doing what you're good at, and that's the exact wrong thing to do. We often use a guideline of 25% of your time should be spent managing up the people above you and doing their job, as opposed to managing down. That's a little uncommon for people because, I manage my team, I don't manage my boss. If you find yourself in this position, asking for feedback from your team, saying, what do you think I do well as a manager? What are some things you think I could do to improve? And have them structure their answers in things to do more of and things to do less of. And then make sure you act on those things. And if you find that they're telling you spend too much time, managing the work product and not enough time communicating the vision or developing and mentoring, that's a sign. And so to the other part of that question, you said, why is micromanaging detrimental to organizations? Because if everybody's micromanaging one level down, then who is doing the job of the leader? Nobody. And so leadership requires a different set of skills, a different set of outcomes, and people aren't promoted from the front lines because they're good managers. They're promoted because they're best at that job. And what is required for them to continue to get better is learning, and interest in learning, and recognizing, the famous Marshall Goldsmith book, what got me here won't get me there. And if I want to really continue to ascend, I have to continue to develop my skills, whether it be through learning, classes, podcasts, whatever it is, constantly wanting to get better. Because as an organization, if everybody's micromanaging, you're constantly going to be behind the curve, because all you're doing is reacting to problems instead of taking time to be proactive, anticipating, connecting people's work to their organizational vision, mission, and developing the people beneath you to hopefully, rise with you as you continue to go up in the organization.
Oh man, I love that. I can listen to this forever, man. I think I said that to you before. I think this is why we're on hour 2 now. So I'm gonna do my rapid fire questions here. Who is your favorite leader and why?
Well, I think the first answer, of course, would be my mentor, boss, and father, Rick. Rick is just profound in so many ways, and so I think that's an easy answer. It's also the true answer. If I were to go historically, who are some of my favorite leaders? I think I'm going to draw on one of my historical. I don't know that they're a favorite, but they're someone I definitely think about in terms of leadership a lot, which is Harry Truman, president. And Harry Truman went from a farmer after he got back from World War I, in his late 20s or 30s, to the vice president in like 20 years. And when he was selected as the vice president, Roosevelt didn't really want him. He just wanted what he brought to the ticket. And then when President Roosevelt died toward the end of the Second World War, Harry Truman was about as far out of the loop as you could be. And then he was thrust into, the biggest, brightest spotlight you could be into. And what I respect about Harry Truman is he had a lot of incredibly hard decisions that he had to make very quickly without really knowing who he could trust. Especially around how to end the war, peace negotiations. And so leaders grappling with hard problems is always very interesting. And Truman, to me, is a fascinating historical figure. Whether you like him or not, whether you agree with his decisions or not, being able to learn from what he had to learn the hard way is something I've gotten a lot out of.
Your favorite guilty pleasure food-wise?
My favorite guilty pleasure food-wise, line up the usual suspects. Pizza, big popcorn fan. Easy Mac was what I snuck in lunch today. I also I'm a big steak fan. Steak and potatoes. There's nothing better. I don't know if that's guilty food, but those are some of my favorite foods.
Favorite music and favorite movie?
My favorite movie is The Godfather, Part 1. An all-time depiction of, I love history, so history, family, hard decisions, and very good quotable movie, which, as I'm sure you know, resonates with me. In terms of music, I am, big into the classics. Big Beatles fan. My first favorite band was The Doors in like the 6th grade. I don't think I quite understood the music, but I like the way it sounded. So yeah, Beatles, I would say, is my all-time favorite band.
So what's on your bucket list? So you could choose one place or something that you want to do that you have not done, Alex, that you're like, I'm kind of scared to do it, but I'm going to do it.
I would say, being a father, which, as you know, I get to do starting in September. So my wife is pregnant. Very exciting. I would say on a professional level, writing a book, co-authoring a book with Rick is definitely on my bucket list. And then sort of on a personal, Alex-centric travel, I want to go to the city of Istanbul. Super fascinated with the history, the sort of fusion of East and West, and that's definitely a trip on my bucket list.
And I know you've heard this a million times. Just say, I can't believe Faye's going to do this to me. What do you want to be remembered for?
What was that?
What do you want to be remembered for?
As a good listener, as someone who did the right things, the right ways, not because someone was watching, but because it was the right thing to do. As someone who helped people, and not just like help them across the street or help them move, but help them accomplish their goals and live a better, more fulfilled life. And I think that's, personally and professionally, someone who is there for people when they need them, even if it's not always telling them what they want to hear. But I've learned, to go back to what we started with, just make sure they're ready for what I have to say, and pick my shots, so that when I do say it, they actually hear me instead of just, listening.
And any book you would recommend anybody read in terms of leadership, and if they're a leader in an organization, because our listeners are going to be from all over the world, what's a good book or resource for someone to become a better leader?
Well, there's a book that has shaped a lot of the way I think. It's called, and I saw the author in grad school, James Pennebaker. So the book is called The Secret Life of Pronouns: What Our Words Say About Us. And what it talks about is how articles, the connector words of our speech and language, reveal far more than we think they do. And that what I love about it, and he's fascinating. When I saw him speak, he created a language processing system that they analyze speeches and emails and all sorts of things. And they can basically tell you things that you're focused on or that you think about. One thing I always remember is in emails, the person who uses I more, who says I more, they showed in their book, is lower on the power dynamic. So they studied emails between students and professors, and based on how many I's someone said in their email, they could typically determine who was the student, who was the professor. Because, you think you email your boss, hey boss, how are you doing? I was hoping I could work on this project. I had this idea. This is kind of what I wanted to do. And I've worked with these people to get some data. And your boss says, sounds good, go for it. So anyways, The Secret Life of Pronouns is pretty profound. It's not necessarily a leadership book, but it's helps you understand communication better. And that's a lot of what leadership is about.
Okay, and this is and I want to tell everybody, thank you so much for listening today. Alex, you've been amazing. You've taken so much of your time today, and I'm so appreciative for it. How do people get in contact with you at your consulting company? How would they reach out to you? What's your website? And then also give your podcast information again.
Sure. So if you want to get in touch, you can, of course, reach out through our website, which is iedlv.com. That's Iota Echo Delta Lima Viper.com. You can also add me on LinkedIn, and the podcast is available on all platforms where you listen. You can search my name, Alex Culley, or the name of the podcast, Learning the Hardway the Easy Way. And we have a lot of fun. As you mentioned earlier, I really do the podcast for myself because I get a lot of all the people I interview and talk to. And if just one person gains something from it as well, I think we've been successful.
Yeah, here. And until next time, everybody, Alex, thank you so much. Keep learning, everybody. Keep working hard. And until next time, and our next wonderful guest, take care and thank you.